and welcome to the Managing Non-Federal Funds Match and In-Kind session. I'm Sarah Forgy, and I'm a CNCS State Program Specialist in Kansas City, Missouri. And joining me today is Ben Stoltenberg.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Ben Stoltenberg, and I'm a Grants Management Specialist at the FFMC, which, of course, as you all know, stands for the Federal Folks Who Mess with Your Cash, or the Field Financial Management Center. And I have the great opportunity for being a specialist for the great states of Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Idaho, Utah, Louisiana, and Wyoming. But we are happy to answer any questions for any other states that are out there, since we love all of you guys. Also with us today is Lauren Jones, who's going to be our moderator, who's going to help you with those questions that you're putting in the Q&A box. And helping her with those questions is from the Atlantic Cluster, the Senior Grants Management Specialist, Anthony DeColi. So he'll be helping us answer your questions, and Lauren will be moderating those questions.
So during this live session, we will describe types of match contributions, review the primary issues and compliance findings, and identify preventive actions to successfully avoid match errors. There is also an e-course on match titled Match Requirements and Documentation that you may find useful and can find in the session's drop-down menu. We will use several live features during this session, including polling. There will be 5 multiple-choice polling questions throughout this session. The polls will make the session more interactive and will help Ben and me to customize the focus of the session based on your feedback. Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature at any time during this presentation to chat your questions. Ben and I will respond to questions at the end of each section. Any questions we are not able to get to will be posted to the Financial Management Message Board in the FFMC booth. Finally, the FFMC has an exhibit booth under the CNCS dropdown. Visit the exhibit booth for a Financial Management Message Board that will address questions not answered during this session, as well as the live chat feature. Both of these follow-up opportunities enable you to ask any lingering questions on financial compliance issues. So to begin, we will review the different types of acceptable match contributions. Then the majority of this session is spent reviewing the most common errors in match, the consequences of match errors, and preventive actions for each type of issue. Finally, the time is reserved at the end of this session for questions and to share experiences with these compliance issues.
Thanks, Sarah. Since now it's shown we have about 530 of you guys from around the country joining our session, which I think is phenomenal. It's almost as if you're required to have match and you really need to pay attention to this. So we really appreciate you joining us. And just to be clear, anyone who signed in thinking this was for Match.com, you're going to be sorely disappointed. This is definitely going to be on your grantee share of your match for your budgets. What we really recommend is if you happen to be sitting at your desk and you have access to your budget, I would recommend pulling that out, especially if you're listening to this later on. To have an actual copy of your budget is something that you're going to see is very important to being able to track your match and identify whether it's allowable and reasonable. So as we look at the acceptable match, when we're talking about match, we're talking about cash and in-kind contributions that have to meet certain criteria. So we want to make sure that the match is verifiable in your grantee record. So you're keeping track of it through your own organization's processes. We want to make sure that your match is necessary and that it's reasonable and that it's accomplishing the goals of your particular program. We want to make sure it's allowable by the cost principles. We're going to look at making sure that your match is not coming from another federal source. And again, like I said, to have that budget there, we have to make sure that the match is provided for in your approved budget and make sure that your match conforms to the grant provisions and other OMB circulars. Some examples of acceptable match is cash. We all love cash. We wish everything was cash. It would make life much easier. It would be great. It's easy to track. It's easy to use. And so cash is obviously the number one choice when it comes to match. But other sources that we can look at are leases, the sale of goods and services, your grants that you get from your state appropriations or from foundations or other corporations, real property, which includes a building that your organization may own or land that gets donated. We're looking at equipment and supplies. And of course, everyone asks what's the difference between equipment and supplies. Equipment has a dollar threshold of at least $5,000 per the piece of equipment. We're looking at services, labor, space, training expenses, and vehicles. These are all sources of acceptable match that when you're looking at have to go along with what we talked about on the earlier side. They have to be verifiable. You have to track them in your records. They can't be from another federal source. So these are all the kind of things that we're going to look at as we go through the different types of match.
So match contributions can broadly be divided into two types, cash and in-kind. Cash match are payments received by cash, check, electronic fund transfer, credit card, or payroll deductions. Cash contributions can be in the form of donations or grants from local governments, state appropriations, foundation grants, or corporate contributions, and leases or the sale of goods and services. However, in-kind contribution is the value of non-cash contributions, and these contributions can come from donated goods and services and other expendable property. In-kind contributions may be in the form of real property, equipment, supplies, services, and other expendable property. And note that in-kind contributions are only eligible to be used to fund one federally financed program.
Common errors in match. So Sarah works in the state office and I work in the grants office, and part of our role is, if you've ever met us, more than likely was on a compliance monitoring visit, which I know all of you love. But most of you, even though you might find it difficult and scary, you also find it as a great opportunity to learn about what you're doing right and what you can do better with your programs. So a lot of these are examples that that come out of monitoring visits from the state office and from grants office, as well as from the IG. So a common thing that we find is that your amounts are not supported by adequate documentation. So every 6 months, you're required to file a federal financial report with, in eGrants saying both your federal share and your grantee share. So we need to know when we come out where that number that you're putting on the grantee share comes from. So you should have supporting documentation, whether that's signed in-kind vouchers, whether it's stuff from your general ledger that proves that $26,384 in grantee share and where it came from. Best practice that we recommend is that for every FFR that you file, you print it and you attach that supporting documentation to it. You keep that in a file or you keep that electronically, but it allows you to always have something there that you can cite to the state office, to the grants officer. This is how I came up with this number and this is how you can verify it. Another common error is other funds are being used to match the programs without authority. So 99% of the time, you cannot use federal funds to match other federal funds. Please do not use your RSVP grant funds to match your SCP grant, or VISTA funds or AmeriCorps funds to match your other stipended programs. It's not allowable. In small percentage cases, if you get authorization from the federal agency that is giving you those grants, and they say, yes, you can use that to match other federal funds, then you can do that. You, of course, would need something from that organization or from that federal agency stating that you can use that to match our grant funds. Another common error is match claimed is unallowable under the applicable OMB cost principles. So you have to make sure that you're using allowed cost just like you are with your federal funds. A key to looking at match is that we consider a match, whether it's in-kind, cash, or from your agency, to be treated exactly the same as if it were federal funds. So if you can't do it with federal funds, the easiest example is, of course, alcohol. You can't buy alcohol with federal funds. You can't accept a match that would come from someone donating alcohol to an RSVP recognition or something like that. So the same rules apply for federal funds as they do for any sort of matching funds. And the same with that, is it necessary to operate the grant? So you wouldn't use RSVP funds to buy supplies that are not supporting an RSVP project. You would not take match funds that support something that doesn't relate to your SCP program. So they have to be necessary to operate the grant, and they have to be reasonable. My favorite example here is if Bon Jovi were to be kind enough to give a concert at your recognition event, and he usually charges $75,000, you would not take that as a $75,000 match to your program. It's not reasonable. It's not something that your organization would pay to have that at the recognition. And furthermore, if you're reading through the cost principles, you would see that entertainment is not an allowable cost to your grant anyway. So there's a lot of things that pop up. So we're really looking at, is it a reasonable expense, whether it's federal funds or whether it's in-kind funds? We have to make sure that the match is inadequately supported to determine if it was allowable or reasonable. So are you tracking the match to make sure that it happened during the time frame of the grant, that it follows all the cost principles, and that it is allowable for your grant funds, just like it would be if it was you're using federal funds to pay for it. Claim match was not related to the cost in the approved budget. So again, for those of you who did go out and dig out your budget, you have to check it and make sure, is this training cost that I'm using to meet my federal match, do I actually have that on my budget? And as you're going through this, and if you see things that, yes, I do count that as match and it's not on my budget, it's a good time to call up Sarah, if you happen to be in Kansas or Missouri, or, call your state office and make sure that you can do an amendment to your budget to make sure everything represented on your budget is actually what's happening. If there's other allowable match that you are tracking, you should have that added into your budget. The last part is match covered expenses incurred outside the grant award period. So that's just making sure that if you have a $10,000 grant from a nonprofit agency that was award that you applied for in, we'll say, if you're RSVP, if you applied for it in January and you didn't actually get the funds until June, you can't use it for the January period that would, of course, end in March 30th. You would have to use it in the term of the grant in which you actually got the funding. So you would use it in the next period.
Consequences of compliance findings. And before we dive into this, I want to take a comment that actually came through the Q&A session, or I should say section on your right-hand side. Someone mentioned that memorials and honorariums can also be counted as cash match, and that is true. Those would be considered cash donations and could come in the form of cash or checks or any of the other options we mentioned earlier. So great point. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so let's talk about the consequences of compliance findings. When there is undocumented, unmet, or unacceptable match, it can reduce some or all of the allowable costs paid with the federal funds in your grant. Even after costs are disallowed, if the grantee fails to comply with the rules of match, then their funds may even be suspended. And furthermore, future funding could be delayed. The most severe action taken, of course, is the termination of the grant. So while we don't want to focus too much on the more severe consequences, we do want to make you aware today of what all the different consequences could be if there is undocumented, unmet, or unacceptable match.
Yes, I think that's kind of the biggest surprise that I run into on monitoring, is explaining that the reason the corporation asks you for a match for your grant is to get that buy-in from your community. I know it's difficult. It's, during the economy, things change, but it really is the idea is to have that buy-in from your organization, from your community, to support the programs, to support the volunteers so that it becomes sustainable. So when we go out and we ask about, show me where your match is coming from, how you document it, and when we explain that if you can't document it, that you can't show us where those numbers come from, that turns into real money. So if you have match for $30,000 that you can't document, you can't show us, that turns into $30,000 that at the end of your grant is owed back to the corporation. So that's why this is really important to be able to show, here's how I document it, here's how it's supported by my fiscal systems, here's how I can show you exactly how I came up with it, and here's how where it's in my budget so that you can kind of check it every year when we put it in. So on those monitorings, we're looking at inadequate documentation for your match and how to prevent those actions. So maintaining documentation. So in the fiscal world, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So whether we're talking about timesheets, supply orders, travel vouchers, the same systems that you use to track those expenses should be used to track your in-kind. So maintaining the same documentation that you use for tracking your federal funds is how you should track your in-kind funds. And again, when it comes down to getting audited or the IG showing up and they're saying, you can't prove this, you owe us the money back, it becomes real very quickly on how you should have been tracking your expenditures for your in-kind. So ensuring the documentation meets the same standards as expenditure. So if you have a process for how you track how you would buy paper or how you would submit a travel voucher, you should have a similar process in place for how you're tracking in-kind at your organization. And a lot of that, you're going to record your in-kind and other documentation in your accounting system. So recording all match in the accounting system is required by the fiscal accounting standards. So a lot of you, I've been out there, some of you do this very well. Your accounting systems are very sophisticated and your fiscal officers are very open to adding this. Some of you have the opposite. Either your accounting system isn't quite there or your fiscal office says this is not a priority and it's not something that we're willing to change to fit in your $3,000 for match or whatever it might be. So it really is a requirement that you have it put in there, but if you don't, you still need to have a process in place. You need to have internal controls. You need to have a written policy about here's how we're going to track our match. And if it's kept on a spreadsheet, if you keep it in Excel, it shouldn't be something that is just held by one person in your organization. It should be something that is auditable, something that is checked by the fiscal office, quarterly or on a 6-month basis, that they're able to go in and say, all right, show me where you're getting your match for your RSVP program and your FGP program, and let's walk through the documentation just as if it were a travel expense or your timesheets. The same sort of rigorous rules and regulations should be put towards your match. And that really is going to be the best thing to keep you out of having problems in the future being audited and having money owed back because you weren't tracking your match properly.
Okay, so let's move on to a scenario. In this situation, a local paint store donates a professional paint sprayer with a fair market value of $550. How should the grantee record this in-kind contribution in the general ledger? So if you'll see on the right of your screen, the poll is open. We'll give you about a minute to choose the best answer, and then we'll follow up as a group. Okay, so hopefully everybody got a chance to respond. And the answer, of course, is C, both. The general ledger should include a debit of $550 to the in-kind expense account and a credit of $550 to the in-kind income account. You always want to make sure that your accounts balance in your ledger, hence recording the value of the in-kind donation in both the expense and the income accounts.
Other federal funds used without the authority. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, and the one example that I can come up with to really show this is meals. So a lot of you use meals from your senior centers, from hospitals as in-kind match. You know, in Section 2, you're getting X amount of meals per X amount of volunteers to make up your match. And a lot of meals that are provided from, you know, depends on different states, are subsidized by federal funds. So what you should be doing with any of your donations that you're receiving is on your, and we'll show you some examples of an in-kind voucher form and what it should look like and how you can use it. But one of those should be, you know, they should identify whether those are from federal funds. And I've seen some great forms and I've seen some not so great forms, but it's a matter of looking at if you're receiving that meal to go and ask that senior site or wherever they're getting the meal from, is any of this subsidized by federal dollars? And if so, how much of it is? So if the meal is $5 and $3 of that is subsidized by federal funds, you would only take a match of $2 for each meal that you put in. And on your voucher, you know, if for meals, you know, we recommend that you have some sort of, you know, whether it's monthly or quarterly, that you're collecting those so you can see exactly how many meals were taken and the amount of that meal is, and it's certified by the organization giving those meals, and that you're able to say, all right, well, it was $5, but we're only taking $2 of each of those meals, and this is the amount that is our match. So just making sure that you're identifying if it is from federal funds, that you're deducting that. And again, in the very rare case that the federal agency allows you to use as match, you have something from them in your files that say, yes, you can use the funds from HUD to match this RSVP grant for this circumstance. So what you don't want to do is you want to make sure that you're not using other federal funds if you don't have that authorization, or that you're deducting the amount of the federal funds from that expense to use for your grant. You want to include a checkbox on your voucher so they can designate that, yes, indeed, it was from federal funds, and then obtain authorization from the other federal agency if they, in fact, are going to allow you to use those funds. So this is what we were talking about for is, you know, unallowable costs. So if you're using match that isn't allowable, you're not tracking it properly, unallowable costs turn into funds owed back to the corporation. And some of the things that we've seen out in doing our monitoring visits is anything belonging to the volunteer that they're doing for you. So if you're talking about the hours that your RSVP volunteer donates, that you're tracking the hours that your FGP, your SCP volunteer is doing for their service, you cannot use those as match. I know that sounds very obvious, but we have seen it. And people give us the same answer that they didn't know. So because there is, if you go out, you can find how much is a volunteer's time worth. And, you know, in some states, that's $19.26 an hour, and multiply that times the time of your RSV volunteers and come up with a number that is not acceptable match. You can't use the time of your volunteers that are in your service program towards your match. So the same with their mileage. So if you have a cap on your mileage of $20 per month, you can't then say, all right, well, Helen actually drove $70 worth of her, you know, past her match or past the cap that we allowed. So we're going to take the $50 and use that as a match. So you can't use any of the expenses from the volunteers, whether it's excess mileage that they're doing, or if you have a fee that you charge for the recognition, that's not acceptable match. And of course, alcohol, again, is not, can never be allowed in any sort of thing as match. So as we're going through and we're saying, you know, these things are not allowable, it doesn't mean that you can't have them. Certainly if you were in the great state of California and you happen to be in Northern California and you have a winery that wants to donate cases of wine towards your recognition event, you don't have to say, no, we don't want them. You just can't use them to count as your match. So you wouldn't, just like you wouldn't use federal funds to buy it, you wouldn't count it as your match, but you certainly would say, thank you for recognizing our volunteers, send them a letter and let them know that it's appreciated. It just wouldn't be tracked as part of your match. So this brings us to our questions section. So we're going to look through and see a couple of questions that I saw. is, does in-kind match require an expense identified in your budget? Absolutely. So your budget should identify where all sources of match are coming from. And one of the number one spots on the budget that gets missed is called the source of funds. So there's a source of funds for Section 1 and a source of funds for Section 2. And in that, every year you should be putting in there Section 1, here's how I'm paying my salaries and my supplies, and that's either from matching from my agency or it's coming from a grant that we get. And Section 2, if you're getting a lot of stuff donated for recognition or meals you're telling us exactly where you're getting that money from. And that's the source of funds in your budget. We know that the budget is your best estimate for what you're going to do for that year. So certainly for those of you who pulled out your budget, you can look and say, we didn't get this grant or we added this. So you can certainly amend that budget to make sure you're showing exactly what it is that you're doing for that year. We always, with your budget, it's a living, breathing document, not something that you just use once a year and kind of fill out. Is it something that you can change, you can adapt, and make sure you're showing exactly what you're doing with your budget and where your funds are coming from? Sarah, did you see any other questions?
I'm just taking a look. One question that popped out a few times is back on our polling question, why did we put the $550 value of the paint sprayer in both income and expenses? And that's a great question. I think that's one that comes up quite a bit when we're actually out doing site visits. And I'll say the short answer, and then maybe Ben can chime in, is you want your general ledger or whatever you're using to show your in-kind to balance. And so you want to enter it in as income that you received the paint sprayer, and then you also want to take it out so that you don't have, an overage of that $550. So you want to also put it in as an expense. And I think about it a lot of times as, you received it and then you used it. So it's going in and it's coming out so that your account evens out. Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Ben?
No, that's exactly right, because we always want the general ledger to balance out to zero. So if you have something that you use and then goes right back out, so I know it's different because it is someone donating their time or donating space or whatever it might be. So it's not something you're actually buying, but that's how you would show it, is coming in and then going out. Another question we got is, we do not pay for volunteers' annual physicals. If a physician donates the cost of the physical, do I need that in the expenses? So I'm assuming that's, when you say in expenses, you mean on your general ledger. So yes, it'd be the same idea. So if every annual physical that is given is worth $100, it would go in as $100 and come out as $100. And again, that would be on your budget, that you're going to have X amount of physicals that are at $100 that are donated every year. And of course, with anything that's donated, you would have the doctor fill out a form for each volunteer that goes to get the physical saying, yes, this is how much this physical is worth, and I sign that it is worth $100. And John Smith received his physical on May 1st, 2014.
Another great question that came through is what would be similar to an invoice when it comes to requesting a donation? So oftentimes a corporation or an organization would like something in writing that actually requests that donation for their records. You may not want to use the term invoice because that has kind of a different meaning. I've seen folks use a donation request form or letter that asks for a donation, and then you would, of course, want to send a receipt to the donor so that they would have that for their records as well. But I think this is something that could also be shared amongst participants in different parts of the virtual conference. I'm sure somebody out there has a really good request form or letter that they've used for their donors.
And probably the last question we'll take, of course, is from my good friend Helen out in Idaho. She asked, is the paint sprayer needed to operate the program? So exactly what we went over before is you have to ask, for anything that's donated, how is it benefiting your program? So I guess if the RSVP program really needed to be repainted because the offices were run down or had mold and needed to be painted and it benefited the program, then yes, in that case you could use the $550. But it is a good question to always ask, is how is it benefiting the program, and is that benefiting the grant monies that we're giving? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. Is the corporation gives you money, and the matching part is to help support that money in the goals of the program that you're running.
All right, so we are going to move on, but please keep the questions coming, and we will take another break for questions towards the end of the presentation. And of course, any questions we don't get to will be answered at the FFMC booth. Moving on to another scenario. To purchase program supplies, the Gateway City Center staff hosted a bake sale. They generate $2,500. And the volunteers used the kitchen of a local church to bake all of the food and receive donations for all of the food ingredients. So the question is this allowable match? And you'll see the polling open on the right side of your screen. I'll give you about a minute to choose the best answer. Okay, hopefully everyone has had a chance to respond. And the answer is yes. The $2,500 generated may be counted as allowable match. However, not the kitchen, the supplies, the planning, or the hosting costs. A spreadsheet showing the money received from the bake sale, including cash, checks, and donations made, should be created to best track the match. And I see that about 3/4 of us got this one right. So way to go.
Making sure match is unnecessary to the grant operation, so preventative actions. Sarah, you're going to take this one.
So another common match finding is that the match claimed is not actually necessary to operate the grant. An unnecessary match might be, for example, a large amount of in-kind recognition items that were collected but never disseminated to volunteers, or services or donations given to the sponsor unrelated to the CNCS-funded program. So preventive actions for ensuring that the match is necessary to operating the grant would include recognizing contributed services in your financial statements if the services received either created or enhanced the non-financial assets or required a specialized skill, are provided by individuals possessing those skills and would need to be purchased if not provided by donation.
That brings us to our next scenario. So Mound City Repair and Service provided coupons for free oil change to all 5 Gateway City Center employees. The value of each oil change is $30. Is this an allowable match? So again, we'll give you about 30 seconds to go in and click yes or no, and then we'll give you the answer. So hopefully most of you picked up on this is the keyword here is the employees. So the employees are getting the coupon. And so in this case is an allowable match, and the answer is no. This match is not allowable because it is not related to the CNCS project. Even if they were all RSVP coordinators, if they were all FGP coordinators, it still doesn't really relate to the program of the grant. If we switch the scenario up and said Mound City Repair and Service provided coupons for all FGP volunteers for their recognition, then you could count that as match because that is given to the volunteers to recognize their service. You give it to them at their recognition, and that would be something that you could use as part of your match. As long as, again, it was part of your budget and it's already, written in there and it's understanding that's what you're going to do. So in this case, when it's just given to the employees, the match is not allowable. So as we're kind of been talking about over and over again, we want to make sure when match is unreasonable or excessive, what are some of the preventive actions that we can get? And I know there's always some interpretation of what is reasonable and not reasonable, or what is excessive and not excessive. And some of the things that you can look at, of course, is the fair market price. You know, what is the value of this item on the open market? So there's a good place to start and say, if someone donated their time or their services, and they usually get paid this amount of money, that's the fair market value. And then, of course, being able to document that. So if John comes in and he wants to do a presentation for your volunteers, and he says he usually makes $400 an hour, you would need to ask him, all right, well, how do you document that? Show me where else you get paid $400. And then you would go and say, consider what it would cost to obtain similar goods and services. Is there someone who does what John does but does it for $50? So if that's the case, then you would take the $50 as in-kind match. Again, if John wanted to do it and he was donating it, you certainly would allow him to do it. You would thank him for it. And you would then, when he does his in-kind voucher, he might put $400, but you're only going to take $50 because that, of course, is what you would actually pay for it if you went out onto the open market. And you're going to keep, the copies of everything that he gave you and understand it. So a lot of this is, when we're looking at reasonableness, is we really want to make sure that, again, we're treating federal dollars the same as you're treating match dollars. So if you're going to take a trip and fly first class, which you would not do with federal dollars, you couldn't donate or use that travel of the first class ticket of $4,000 as match to your grant, where you should have only spent $250, because that's what's allowable by the grant, allowable by the cost principles. So reasonableness is a big issue. If you ever have a question about reasonableness, you have grants officers. Feel free to call us and say, is this reasonable? Gift bags is always a big one with this, is if someone is donating gift bags to your program, say you get the most wonderful gift basket you can imagine. There's apples from Fiji and vanilla from Madagascar and flowers and whatever else it might be. They tell you these gift baskets are worth $380, and you're going to give them to 100 of your volunteers. It is very easy to see this is not reasonable. It is not something that your organization would pay if you went to your fiscal office and say, I want to buy 100 $380 gift baskets to recognize my volunteers. They're going to laugh at you and say, no, we would give you $5 or $10 or whatever it might be that they would choose to say this is a reasonable amount of money to spend on your volunteers. So you're always asking those questions. Is it reasonable? Is it allowable? Is it allocable to the RSVP, SCP, or FGP program?
All right, so let's jump into another scenario. This is on a scenario on whether a contribution is excessive or unnecessary. So the University of Missouri provides a conference room for Gateway City Center on an as-needed basis. The university official represented that when they normally rent the room, the fair market value of the room was $150 per usage. Gateway City Center used the room 10 times throughout the year for 8 program trainings, 1 education research forum, and 1 Gateway City Center holiday party. So is this contribution allowable? We'll give you about a minute to answer the polling question, yes or no. Okay, and hopefully everyone has had a chance to answer. And the answer is yes. 8 trainings at $150 each would be allowable. However, it is not allowable to include the forum or the entertainment. And you would want to have documentation that includes a letter from the university with the value, how the fair market value was determined, and the dates of usage by Gateway City Center. And again, that would be for your 8 program trainings that are required under the grant. The Education Research Forum and the Gateway City Center holiday party would be examples of things that are not allowable.
So again, for those of you who have pulled out your budget and you're thinking about your sources of match, you're looking at your budget categories and you're making sure that, oh yes, we do have trainings and I see that on my budget, or you're thinking, we do count all these trainings and I don't see them on my budget. You need to make sure that you update your budget and make sure that you know exactly how you're tracing and accounting for all your match. If you're a brand new director, which I know some of you are out there, so welcome, but maybe you got a budget that you had nothing to do with, you didn't have any input, someone just gave it to you. You also need to kind of take over and make sure you know exactly where that person was getting the match from, that they, you know, if the source of funds is left blank, that you go through and make sure you know exactly where they're getting that money from and where it's coming from your organization, from other grants, and just make sure you're fully aware so that you can track it going forward and know exactly what to say when the corporation shows up and asks you, all right, show me on the FFR, this is the amount, I want to see how you got it. And really the only way to do that is to use your budget as a guide to make sure you can have those answers ready for us when we show up. The next scenario is talking about volunteer time donated. So a longtime volunteer has a family member who works for the Geek Squad as a computer technician. The technician wants to, quote, give back and volunteers 2 hours every week to update the computer systems, software, and fix email problems. This individual earns $49 per hour at the Geek Squad. Besides wondering where we went wrong and why we don't work for the Geek Squad, is this contribution allowable? So you just have a little bit more time to hit yes or no, and then make sure you hit submit so that it goes through. So the answer here is, of course, yes. The contribution is allowable, and a lot of you got that. The contribution is allowable if the organization would pay a computer technician $49 per hour to update the computer systems. If so, a monthly time log from the volunteer and documentation of the rate of pay, a copy of the pay stub, for example, would be required. So in this case, you have someone who is giving has a skilled set that he's offering to the RSVP or FGP or SCP program to help them with their computers. He has a rate that he charges, which your organization defines as something that they feel is reasonable and that is what they would pay. And then you get the documentation to back it up. If the organization were to say, no, we would not pay $49 per hour, we would in fact pay $25 per hour. Again, you don't have to turn him away and say, we can't take your services. You would take all the same information, you would take the in-kind form, and instead of the $49 that he marked down, you would say we took a cost of $25 per hour for X amount of hours as our in-kind match. So we never want to get into a situation where you're refusing people who want to help you just because their match is not allowable to your grant or can't be used as part of your recognition costs. You always want to thank everybody. You don't want to turn them away. It's just a matter, internally for you to decide this is what we can use as authorized match to our grant. This is what we can't. We still want people to recognize our volunteers with their $380 gift baskets. We still want the Geek Squad to come in and help us with our computers, but we have to take a reasonable amount of money as match for those contributions.
So the next finding that we will cover is when the match contribution is inadequately supported to determine if it is allowable or allocable. The preventive actions for this finding include using the in-kind contribution form to document donations. And an in-kind match documentation should include all of the following: the name of the donor, a description of the contributed items or services, the date of receipt, the value of the contribution and how that value was determined and who determined it, the printed name and title of the donor, the signature of the donor or their representative, the signature of the grantee official who accepted the contribution and his or her printed name and title, and if the donor had any restrictions on how the donation could be used.
The next scenario that we're going to look at is back to the Gateway Center. So the Gateway Center received a donation of 5 computers from Dell. The computers have a fair market value of $1,500, which was provided in a signed and dated voucher from Dell. Is this contribution allowable? Yes or no? And we'll give you about 30 seconds to throw in your answers. And then just while we're doing that, one of the questions I saw pop up was again about that volunteer mileage and whether that if volunteers are donating their time over and above that cap that you're allowing, can that be counted as match? And again, the answer is no. And you can actually find that in your RSVP or SCP or FGP handbooks. It's right there that you can't use the volunteers any sort of excess mileage or meals they didn't take as match towards your grant. Again, we don't want to put the onus on the volunteers to be providing support for the grant. And the answer is overwhelmingly, we got 90% yes to this. So this is pretty straightforward. This is the best case scenario. So the contribution is allowable because the project has a signed and dated voucher from Dell describing the computers and listing of value. One of the common things we find on some vouchers is that you guys are actually designating the value of a service that's given to you, and it really has to be the person giving you the service or the computers in this case of them designating this is the value that we assign that we're donating to this organization. And then again, you would go through and assess whether it is allowable, allocable, reasonable to your grant and move forward from there.
So what does the in-kind contribution form look like? Well, here is just one example. And the important features of the sample in-kind contribution form include, under the Contributed Goods of Services heading, provide a detailed description of the goods or services provided on the line titled Description of Contributed Goods or Services. So that's what was donated. The question, how was the value determined, assesses how the monetary value of goods or services was determined, if it was through an actual value or an appraisal. When filling out the form, you'd check either box, and you'd also want to check the box for the option that matches the value determination process. Additionally, provide the name of the individual who made the value determination on the line titled Who Made the Value Determination? This would most likely be the donor. And the contribution is assessed for federal funds through the yes or no question. Was this contribution obtained with or supported by federal funds? So right there, you would know if it was federal funds or not. The in-kind contribution form is then signed and dated by the donor on the line entitled Signature of the Contributor. And finally, in the white box labeled Office Use Only, the person receiving the goods or services at the sponsor also signs the form. We're going to go ahead and look at another example of an in-kind contribution form. And this second example of an in-kind donation form asks for all the same information as our previous form. The only difference is the layout. So you can see that you have some different options here. To properly document an in-kind contribution, provide the following information. So we have the date of contribution, a description of the contributed item or the service, the purpose for which the contribution was made, the real or approximate value, how the value of the good or service was determined. So this could include the actual value, an appraisal, the fair market value, the item's condition, whether it was new or used, the value of like services or a retail comparison, the source of the value determination, so who actually determined the value of the contribution, and whether the contribution was obtained with or supported by federal funds. And if it was obtained with or supported by federal funds, what was the source? And again, you'll see all the same name of the contributing organization, agency, business, or individual, their signature, and their date that they donated, and then also the signature, name, and title of the person who received the donation.
So matches unrelated to the approved budget. So again, all of you who have pulled out your budget and you've been thinking about match and where it comes from and how you've been tracking it, you're looking at your budget and you've seen things that are not there that you want to be there, you need to do an amendment. And you can do an amendment to your budget through eGrants. You can work with your state office and your grants officer to make sure that it is there. If it's not there, and you don't put it there, when we come out to do a monitoring or if the IG were to come, they're going to ask you why exactly are you counting this as not in your budget. So a lot of this we're looking at if you're RSVP, you have a 30% required match. If you are FGP or SCP, you have a 10% match. Many of you in your budgets overmatch. You're at 40%, you're at 15%. I've seen a lot of programs who go through a lot of trouble to track match that is over and above. My recommendation really is to prioritize your match. If you're getting big travel support grants, those are your biggies. You want to make sure that you have the documentation for that. And if you've met your match, if you're at 10% or you're at 30%, do not chase down these $5 donations and $10 donations if you don't need to. You're only required to meet 30% for RSVP, 10% for FGP, and SCP. Unless you're in your first or second year of RSVP, then it's 10, 20, then 30. But we only hold you to that requirement. If you want to put more on your budget, you're certainly welcome to. It certainly helps you if you lose portions of your grant, and it helps you make up for that. But don't spend your time trying to chase down sources of in-kind when you don't need to. So if you don't really need to track it for our grant over and above the required amount, don't waste your time trying to run down and get this sign from this trainer and this sign for that person to get $50 and $25 if you don't need to. If you need to, then yes, you have to go out and do that. You have to get it signed. You have to have an understanding and a process in place to do all that. But I've seen a lot of grantees who spend a lot of time chasing down to make sure they can show they have 57%. And they spend a lot of time doing that where they really only need to show the corporation the 30% or 10%.
All right, so the last common error that we will discuss during this session is when match is used to cover expenses incurred outside of the grant award period. So let's review this scenario. A donation of $10,000 to support the RSVP program is solicited on January 31st. However, the donation is not made to the program until April 30th, and this particular program's grant award begins April 1st. When should you record the match? In this case, the donation could be counted as match in the grant award period beginning April 1. It could not be counted as match during the grant period in which it was solicited. Do not record in-kind or other match until it is collected and the documentation supporting it is sufficient. All right, so let's open it up for some questions. And I see a really great one that relates to our last scenario. Someone asked that she applies for many local grants, and some are awarded and some are not. How can she go about anticipating whether or not these grants will be awarded when she creates her budget? So I think there's really two questions in here. When you create your budget at the beginning of the year, that's absolutely correct. You might not know for sure if you're going to get those local match funds or not. And that's why you would contact your program officer throughout the year, talk it out. Maybe an amendment is necessary if a certain number of local grants come in, but others you anticipated did not. And so you're going to be looking for different sources of match. So I think this kind of goes back to just keeping those lines of communication open and letting your program officer know if, hey, I put in this large source of match, but actually I'm going to be going a different direction. But this also goes back to the scenario we just looked at, that you want to make sure not to count your match until it actually comes in. So you might apply for some grants throughout the year, and maybe some of those grants come through in a different grant year than when you applied for them. And so you want to be sure to count them when you actually have them in and you have all the documentation you need. So it's all backed up and ready to go.
There also seem to be a lot of questions about space. And so, again, if you're looking at your budget, if you're using space for an allowable cost that's on your budget, say for your recognition or for a training event, then of course, yes, you can use that in kind. So at the university, I think a lot of people saw that there was a holiday party. Why couldn't that be used as match the grant? It depends on who is at. Is the holiday party for just employees, or is it for part of a recognition event? So if it's part of the recognition event, then yes, it's part for the volunteers. You're required to do a recognition event. Then of course you can count that as space. If it's your office that you're using, that you can count that space, you're certainly welcome to do that. So if it falls into an allowable cost in your budget, then of course you can use in kind for those purposes of match. And some other questions about match. Many people were asking how do you come up with a dollar value? You would again have to ask the person who's giving you that service to put a dollar amount on it. You need to be careful to make sure that that person, if it's the chief of police that comes and speaks to your volunteers, but he also speaks at schools, to make sure that if he speaks for free for everybody else, he can't come to your organization and say, well, yeah, I think my time is worth $300 an hour, so you're going to get in kind for $300 an hour. So if it's part of their regular duties to go out and speak and volunteer, or for someone in your own organization that's part of their regular roles, then that wouldn't be counted as in kind. If it's someone who specifically does training, then that's something that you would look at and have them fill out the voucher and value their time, and then take it back to your fiscal office and say, is this something that we would actually pay had we gone out and had to buy this service? And I think that kind of brings us to the end of our time. Again, we do have some grants officers that are looking at all the questions that were submitted. I think they're doing a great job of answering them. We will be around for the rest of the day as well as in tomorrow. We have the FFMC booth that is open. You can certainly leave questions, and we're going to post a lot of our answers there. If you don't know who your grants officer is, you definitely can contact your state office, and they'll be happy to give us our information. If you happen to be one of my states, hopefully you know who I am, but you're certainly welcome to contact me at any time. And even if you're not, you can contact me, and I'll make sure you get in touch with your own grants officer. And of course, anyone in the corporation, our email is just a first initial of our first name and our last name, so bstoltenberg@cns.gov, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or get you in touch with the right person.
So thank you for joining us for the Managing Non-Federal Funds Match and In-Kind session. Here's a summary of some of the key points that we went over. But again, please visit the FFMC booth for any additional information or answers to questions.
Thanks, everybody.